We're gonna move on now to what is, in my opinion, the definitive video game adaptation of Spider-Man 3, released for 7th generation consoles in May of 2007. While its graphics are primitive, the very early days of the era, when character models looked great, but environments were very basic, spacious, and lacked polish, from a tech standpoint, it is the most adept of all its versions, spanning all platforms, and is the most accurate in recreating the events of the film it's based on. As movie-licensed superhero games go, Spider-Man 3 is one of the stronger ones out there if you ask me. In fact, I still think it's one of the best Spider-Man games in general, despite its flaws, which I will get into. If you've watched my previous review on its last-gen counterpart, then you would know that the PS3 version of Spider-Man 3 passed me by when it first came out. It wasn't until recent years that I played this game for the first time, and capturing it for this video was the first time I've ever fully completed it from start to finish. The controls in it impressed me. They feel like a natural and solid continuation of the ones found in Spider-Man 2 from the previous generation. You can run by holding L2 and charge up your jump, temporarily run up walls by pressing L2 and circle when you make contact with them, and the web swinging has been expanded, made far more responsive and tight than in the PS2 port of the game, which felt very sticky. By this point, the web swinging was moving in the right direction in these Spider-Man games. The controls were becoming more fluid, and it honestly started getting really fun. You really felt like you were Spider-Man swinging through New York City. As long as you are close enough to a building, holding R2 shoots out a web line. Tapping it performs a trusty web zip. By holding L2 down during a swing arc, you can boost yourself to move faster, and holding the X button builds height. If you've played Web of Shadows from 2008, a lot of these swing animations will look familiar to you. Most of them were recycled for that game. I think Spider-Man 3 has easily the best web swinging system in any movie-licensed Spider-Man game, before and after it. Like I said at the start, this was the early days of the 7th generation, so while the graphics are better, there is still a lot of room for improvement. Texture popping was an issue, screen tearing was commonplace, and a lot more detail could be added to the environments overall. The city of New York definitely feels more alive in this one than it did on the PS2 though, and the buildings have a lot more variety to their shapes and colors. The buildings in the PS2 game felt very basic, like cardboard boxes that had been copied and pasted 100 times over. Every rooftop was a simple square or rectangle. Very few had additional features attached to them. Here, we see that a lot more work has been put into it. The city has far more personality to it, as it should. It's New York, for Christ's sake. Another aspect of the gameplay that feels like it builds upon what had come before is the combat. The controls for it are virtually identical to what was in Spider-Man 2, and many of the punch and kick animations are similar as well. I don't think it's as enjoyable as that fighting system though. I do like the use of the blue spider reflexes meter, activated by holding L1 to perform dodges when the yellow fist icon appears over the heads of enemies, and I also like the red spherical meter between your health and spider reflexes that allows you to do devastating special attacks on groups of enemies once it begins flashing. But when you are forced to fight large numbers of enemies, things can get a bit overwhelming. The camera will move all over the place, and the weight of everything feels very floppy. That's the best word I can use to describe it. While I find the combat in this game to be better than in the PS2 version, it can still be really awkward at times, and some encounters in this game can get rather difficult. One second you have full health, and the next you're essentially dead, which is why it's imperative that you earn yourself the 2 health upgrades this game provides for you after beating enough crime waves and side missions involving the various gangs threatening the city. You need to reduce their presence in each zone. Speaking of which, the PS3 version of Spider-Man 3 features an additional gang, Arsenic Candy, a bunch of young women wielding sledgehammers, weaponized umbrellas that wear frilly miniskirts, and rob teddy bear factories. You think I'm joking? I'm not fucking joking. Spider-Man 3 implements Spider-Man's spider sense that acts almost like the detective vision in the Batman Arkham games, allowing you to see highlighted enemies and follow clue trails. Problem is, it only stays on for a few seconds before automatically turning off, meaning you constantly have to turn it back on, which is annoying. I get that the developers may not have wanted you to abuse it, but then again, it really doesn't show you all that much anyways. At least not to the extent of Batman Arkham. So why does it matter? If you're not gonna let me keep it on, then don't make me follow trails of footprints that last several minutes at a time. It seems counterintuitive. And speaking of counterintuitive, the controller prompts in this game can get really confusing during a few sequences. Hitting square and circle repeatedly to lift objects is one thing, but then you have to hit a swinging chandelier by holding and releasing square at intervals. Other parts have Spider-Man slingshotting himself with his web. Based on what appears on screen, one would assume you hold the left analog stick down, but you actually have to flick it down several times quickly before letting go at a specific moment. And I don't think I have to be the one to tell you that this feels terrible, kinda hurts the thumbs. I ended up putting the controller on my lap or holding it like a cell phone and used all my fingers on the other hand to move it. It was the only way I could do it fast enough. It's ridiculous. Who thought that was okay to program? The story in this game doesn't play out in a straightforward linear fashion, like in many other Spider-Man games. It consists of several mission chains. Each of the main story missions are unlocked after beating enough side missions, mostly related to gang activity, but of course, some involve side characters and side villains from the comics as well. One has you uncover a gun-running ring and take photo evidence of police corruption for Detective Gene DeWolf. If that name sounds familiar, it's because DeWolf was a notable ally of Spider-Man in the late 1970s and early 80s, who was killed at the hands of the Sin Eater in the iconic 1985-86 story arc, The Death of Gene DeWolf. In the game, she is found out by her crooked partners and shot, but manages to survive thanks to Spider-Man. I feel having DeWolf die in the game, much like in the comics, while it would have been predictable, would have added some more layers to the story, and further negatively impact Peter's psychological state, on top of what the symbiote ends up doing to him. He could have gone on an investigation to find the murderer, emphasize the more violent change in his behavior even more than what we got in the game, maybe even include Sin Eater as another one of the side villains too. But I can see the developers feeling that would be a bit much, and that DeWolf's death may have taken attention away from the events of the Spider-Man 3 film the game was trying to adapt, so I'm not gonna dock it too many points for that. There's a couple side missions that have you take Mary Jane on a series of thrill rides on progressively harder difficulty levels. There's a time limit to get her to her destination. You need to swing higher, lower, or perform tricks, depending on what she wants Peter to do to earn points. You can also collect giant floating hearts that are scattered around. It's a bit cringy to be perfectly honest, and the voice acting doesn't help matters. Later on in the game, when Peter's behavior has been influenced by the black suit, the thrill ride becomes a scare ride. The waypoints have you swinging more erratically, higher, and in different directions, until MJ has had enough and breaks up with Peter for being such a huge asshole. I don't blame her. Not cool, bro. Not cool. A few of the side villains carry over from the PS2 version. Luke Carlisle, the Mad Bomber, has a score to settle with J. Jonah Jameson for printing a story that ruined his company. His missions put an emphasis on disarming explosives, which consist of consecutive mini-games, leaning into Peter's brilliance and problem-solving skills. While fun, they never reach incredibly challenging levels. I always found myself having plenty of time left over, and some of the mini-games feel very unnecessary from a gameplay perspective, just there for the sake of it and nothing else. Fighting the Mad Bomber's jetpack goons is hilarious. You hop on their backs and steer them into nearby walls to damage them. It looks goofy and janky as hell, but never gets old. Unlike the PS2 port of the game, you never battle Carlisle himself, just his military helicopter while saving Jonah with the bomb collar strapped around his neck. You have to wait until the copter shoots a large missile at you that you throw back at it using your spider reflexes. You then hide behind the various rooftop structures to avoid its machine gun fire, and then web zip to escape the countless smaller missiles it fires at you. Rinse and repeat. The part of the story centering around Dr. Kurt Connors the Lizard is far more interesting than it was in the PS2 version of Spider-Man 3. Connors transforms into his monstrous counterpart all the same, and turns innocent New Yorkers into his lizard minions out of a lab built in the sewers. After you cure him, the game takes the time to show the heroes undoing the lizard's damage. Using a serum of Connors' design, Spider-Man returns underground to turn the remaining lizard creatures back into humans. I also like how the PS3 version explores a bit more of Connors' psychological trauma, the nightmares he has of the lizard, and the guilt he feels over what he has done. Along the way, you battle Kraven the Hunter as well, who has traveled to New York to hunt Connors and the rest of the lizard creatures. In this version of the game, he is accompanied by Calypso, who uses her potions and charms to assist him. The Kraven fight is much stronger than it was on the PS2. I like how he takes on the characteristics and abilities of various animals, with a translucent form of armor representing them, covering his upper body. I like the inclusion of the priestess Calypso too. She's a bit more obscure. Calypso's magic is what causes the lizard to turn into Mega Lizard in this version of the game, so it's given more context and doesn't just happen at complete random. Instead of riding Mega Lizard into the 4 generators, you have to throw him using your web, and it can be a real pain in the ass lining it up and getting the timing right with the analog stick. It took me multiple attempts. There are a few villains in this game that were exclusive to the next-gen versions of Spider-Man 3. The first is Mac Gargan, the Scorpion. He's made into a tragic anti-hero, sort of like the character's appearance in the original movie's tie-in game, though this one is not meant to be the same character. A bit of a missed opportunity there, in my opinion. Gargan is the test subject of a cybernetics company called Mecha Biocon, which to my knowledge only exists within this game and is not found in the comics. The company is run by a female version of scientist Farley Stillwell, the one responsible for creating Scorpion in the comics. Another scientist, the one in charge of the Scorpion Project, is named Dr. Andrews, who has developed a close relationship with Gargan over time. Whether it's romantic or not is not made clear. Gargan has been blackmailed by Stillwell, forced into becoming a brainwashed bounty hunter for her and her company. Scorpion's design in this game is rather ugly. I'm not a fan of it. It's obviously made more mechanical looking. He has a scythe-like tail, drills that come out of his hands, and a plexiglass visor that covers his eyes. Infiltrating Mecha Biocon is a hassle. Navigating it isn't fun. Inside the facility, you play this bizarre minigame as Scorpion, earning a high score in order to shut down a few security measures. Escaping the facility while all the blast doors are closing is tough, because the camera fights against you. It's your worst enemy. Thank God you can slow down time with your spider reflexes. After chasing Scorpion to a bridge, you battle him, and awkwardly as all hell, use the energy blast from his tail to destroy a series of generators powering the machine that is causing his brainwashing. Eventually, Scorpion becomes your ally, ditches his costume, and teams up with you to return to Mecha Biocon to enact his revenge against Stillwell. It's here where you battle Rhino, another one of the company's experiments, and another character in this game with an ugly-ass design. It's grody. Once Rhino is defeated, Gargan attempts to kill Stillwell, but after some convincing from Spider-Man and Dr. Andrews, he just runs away instead and is never heard from again. The developers tried to do something cool and compelling with Scorpion here, provide a bit more backstory for him, a tragic element to it all, but his mission chain only manages to scratch the surface with these ideas. So much more could have been done with him in this game, and really, I was left unsatisfied with his section. It lasted far too long as well. And finally, after completing all of the mission chains for all the gangs in the city, you go to a press conference and learn that the one controlling them all is none other than Wilson Fisk, the kingpin of crime. You battle the combined might of the gangs who disrupt the conference, and then go to Fisk's penthouse to put an end to all of the gang violence once and for all. There's a sequence here where you fight 3 of the gang leaders at once, which is pretty tricky. Once you get through them, you take on Kingpin himself. I'd say this is one of the better Kingpins in video games. Breaking into his penthouse and causing all this damage to it is awesome. He also fucks up Spider-Man, slamming him through walls, concrete pillars, and tossing him downstairs. The 2 boss battles you have with him back to back kinda suck though. All you do is hold L1 to activate your spider reflexes and counter his attacks. It's the best strategy because if he does land any hits, he does a lot of damage. Some of the grab animations are really cool though. Kingpin does feel shoehorned into this game. He doesn't get a whole lot of dialogue. There isn't a whole lot of context provided as to why he shows up in the story. Your fight against him occurs later in the game, after Spider-Man has been affected by the symbiote. After you beat him, Spider-Man throws him out a large window to the streets below. He wonders if Fisk could have survived the fall, but he doesn't think it matters and moves on. I know the suit has been making Peter reckless and aggressive, but it still feels wrong hearing that sort of thing come out of Spider-Man's mouth, and it's not like the game shows us that Kingpin is alive. For all we know, he really did fall to his death. Spider-Man killed him and doesn't care. Not a good look for the character. Alright, let's get into the main story, what was adapted from the Spider-Man 3 film, and how it differs from the last-gen version of the game I looked at. Harry's pissed at Peter over the death of his father, the Green Goblin, and goes after him, wanting blood. The fight against him in this game is much, much better. You have to fight him on his snowboard-looking glider after he ambushes you, dodging his attacks and then matching the button prompt shown to deal damage of your own. The fight on the glider does last a bit too long in my opinion and becomes a little boring, seeing as it is just a bunch of quick-time events, but once New Goblin's health drops low enough, you are knocked off the glider and the fight turns to the streets. You can run around and swing through the city with New Goblin and his glider hot on your tail, which makes for a neat visual. I wonder how many people, if any, would recognize Peter or would remember his face though moving forward. That could be a problem, at least it's nighttime. After defeating New Goblin, Harry is knocked out far more accurately to how he was in the film, hitting his head and not just crashing off screen like he does in the PS2 port. You actually carry him to the hospital to treat his amnesia as well, something the PS2 game didn't even address. Just like in the movie, an alien symbiote that crash-landed on Earth bonds with Peter while he sleeps and creates a black version of his Spider-Man costume. The alien entity slowly corrupts him, enhancing his negative characteristics, making Peter dangerously aggressive towards his enemies and those around him. Not only does his relationship spiral with MJ, like I previously mentioned, but you see some other sleazy, disrespectful behavior from Peter as well, like putting his feet up on Jonah's desk and forcing himself onto Betty Brant briefly, which is gross. As much as I love the inclusion of the symbiote suit in this game, and graphically it looks pretty decent, far better than it did in the PS2 version, I don't think it was implemented as strongly. You don't have the option to switch to it at any time. You only wear it when the game needs you to wear it, and remove it when the story requires you to take it off. It doesn't have its own unique attack animations or combos. Aside from a rage meter replacing the special attack one, it just feels like a simple reskin of the regular suit, pretty bland and uninspired compared to some other Spider-Man games we've gotten over the years. Anywho, after Peter is bonded with the symbiote, he encounters Flint Marko, the Sandman, for the first time. He chases the villain into the subway tunnels, and the fight between the two men is pretty violent, ending in Spider-Man bursting open a pipe and washing Sandman away. I would have loved it if Peter had said a good riddance like he does in the movie, but sadly, no. Late in the game's story, we are introduced to Eddie Brock, a rival photographer of Peter's at the Daily Bugle, looking to provide evidence that Spider-Man is a criminal. He goes to take pictures of the wall crawler in the act of stealing. Unlike the PS2 game that had Brock believably dressed somewhat in a black Spider-Man suit trying to nab a purse, here he just gets some random fat guy with his belly poking out to put on the classic red and blue costume, not the one worn by Spider-Man in the falsified pictures from the film. I don't find the joke that funny, and anyone believing this to be the real Spider-Man would be a moron. Spider-Man arrives to knock Brock out and steal his camera, but then you have to find the rest of his cameras on fire escapes, rooftops, and the sides of buildings that he had planted as well. I'd like to know just how in the fuck he managed to reach some of these places. When did he find the time? All of it is just so ridiculous that it's dumb. Peter's behavior becomes too much, and realizing that the symbiote is to blame for it, he goes to a nearby church, and using the sonic vibrations of its bell, is able to remove the alien from his body. The symbiote lands on Brock down below, and he transforms into Venom. He would confront Sandman in a park and blackmail him into helping him kill Spider-Man, threatening to kill his daughter Penny if he doesn't cooperate. They use a slightly different vocal effect for Venom in this game than they did for the PS2 version. I think it sounds worse and makes him harder to understand.
Freak? I'm the freak. Have you looked in the mirror lately? Now, let's talk about how we're going to destroy the spider.
Freak? I'm the freak. Have you looked in the mirror lately? Now, let's talk about how we're going to destroy
The spider.
The grand finale in the PS3 game is far more accurate to the film than its last-gen counterpart, taking place in and around the partially constructed building and not just in some nearby sandlot. I am hesitant to call it better though for a few reasons. The villains kidnap Mary Jane and lure Spider-Man out with a message on live TV. Harry is watching and decides to come to his friend's aid. It's here where you get to play as the new Goblin. He was a DLC character you could fly around as after beating the story in free roam, but during the main game, you only play as him in the final mission. The novelty wears off pretty quick though, because his control is utter horseshit. By default, it uses the motion control of the PS3 controller, which is an absolute nightmare. I hated when games used it. I've mentioned it numerous times before. It was terrible. Harry goes to save MJ from the suspended taxicab while Peter is distracted fighting Venom. As New Goblin, you take on the giant Sandman, using a fire hydrant to moisten him, and then using your pumpkin bombs and razor bats to damage him. It might not seem like it, but the boss battle with Sandman at the end of the game is the worst in Spider-Man 3 in my eyes, because all it is you mashing buttons and moving the analog stick back and forth for like 5 minutes. As Spider-Man, you do battle with Venom, with the encounter being split up and sandwiching the fight you have with Sandman. You attack him until the symbiote is angered, and then stun it using the sound of infinitely respawning stacked pipes that are strewn around the various levels of the building. It is now time that I go into one of this game's more irredeemable aspects that has aged it a great deal, and the main reason I can't see myself playing it a whole lot in the future: its overuse of QuickTime events. QTEs should never have been a thing in video games. They were never fun, never injected any sense of realism or immersion to the games you were playing. They were, and unfortunately still are, a lazy and stupid gimmick that I feel shows a complete disregard for gamers with disabilities, and those with poor reaction time in general, which I hate to break it to you, gets worse and worse as you age. You should always have the option to turn QTEs off in video games, at the very least. The two QuickTime event sequences at the end of Spider-Man 3, the one with New Goblin against Sandman and the one with Spider-Man against Venom, are excruciating. Most of the QTEs throughout the game are relatively simple and straightforward, but these require immensely precise timing. I can't tell you how many times I had to retry them. The memorization I had to do through trial and error was insane. Each time I would get 1 or 2 steps farther and have to restart all over again, and each failure results in your character taking damage. Eventually, you would have to play the entire boss fight again just to get another attempt at it. If you manage to get through them, though, in the final one against Venom, you witness his death, a much darker one than in the movie and PS2 game, with him getting impaled on steel rods. I wasn't expecting it. Flint Marko is then reunited with his daughter Penny. Just like in the last-gen version of the game, there is no mention of Marko playing a role in the death of Uncle Ben like in the film. I think that was a missed opportunity. As much hate as it gets sometimes, I actually liked it. I thought it gave Marko a great arc, very emotional, and Peter got some closure too. It was a nice way to wrap up the trilogy. After beating the game, you unlock the ability to switch to black-suited Spider-Man at any time, and can replay the entire game wearing it if you want to, a form of New Game Plus. Despite its serious issues with its over-reliance on QuickTime events, especially at the end, Spider-Man 3 can still be a really fun time. I found myself enjoying it a lot more than I thought I was going to. It is an early 7th generation title. It is a bit primitive in areas. You can tell the developers didn't have a firm grasp of the hardware, but I do think it's one of the stronger Spider-Man games out there, movie licensed especially. The original Spider-Man trilogy is probably the best series of games based on a series of superhero films that has ever been made. Arguably, each game got progressively better from a graphical and mechanical standpoint. They came out at a time when developers were actually trying with movie-licensed superhero games. I think it was when they were at their absolute peak. This has been NerdGasm. Let me know your thoughts on the official Spider-Man 3 movie tie-in game down in the comments section below. If you'd like to show your support for my channel and its content, think about subscribing and become a producer over on Patreon if you can. If there are any superhero or comic book related video games you'd like me to take a look at in the future, you can nominate them over on Patreon as well. I will see you all in the next one. Take care. Thanks for watching, and always stay nerdy.